On a warm Nebraska evening in late September 2012, 36-year-old Dave Krupa left work feeling better than he had in weeks. He was thinking about the woman he had met that afternoon in the auto body shop where he worked. Dave had been helping another customer when this woman arrived, but as soon as he saw her, he completely forgot about what he was doing and just stared. Her name was Carrie Farber. She was 5'7" tall, she was slender and tanned with light brown hair, and she had hazel eyes and a dazzling smile. Dave had suddenly felt like he was right back in high school, all thumbs as he handed change to the customer standing in front of her. Then, Carrie stepped to the counter, gave Dave a friendly nod, and told him her black Ford Explorer needed some minor but immediate maintenance work. As they arranged for Carrie to bring her car right then into the service area, Dave had felt an instant sense of ease and attraction between the two of them. The last 6 months had been difficult for Dave, and unexpected moments like this one were very welcome. Dave had moved to Omaha, Nebraska from his home state of Iowa 5 months earlier in April after he and his longtime girlfriend Amy had both agreed it was time to end their 10-year-long relationship. And once he had arrived in Nebraska, he'd been offered a manager job at this Hyatt Tire auto body shop. The oldest of 3 brothers born to deeply religious Southern Baptist parents, Dave had worked hard at being a good boyfriend and provider and a great dad. He and his ex-girlfriend Amy had parted on friendly terms and worked out a custody arrangement so Dave could see their 2 children a couple times a week. But even so, his small, barely furnished apartment not far from the auto body shop had felt depressing. And since Dave had been in this very serious relationship for the last decade, he had arrived in this new city without any idea how to re-enter the dating scene. He had signed up for a dating website called Plenty of Fish within a few weeks of his arrival in town, and over the summer he had in fact gone on maybe a dozen dates with several women he had met online. But seeing this woman, Carrie, in his auto shop was different. It was the first time in a long time Dave had met someone the old-fashioned way, through a chance in-person encounter rather than by surfing pictures and descriptions posted on the Plenty of Fish website. Now, as Dave walked away from the auto shop over to where his car was parked in the lot to head home for the night, he wished that he had just asked Carrie out on a date when he had a chance to earlier in the day. But at the same time, he thought to himself, it would have been unprofessional or maybe even inappropriate for him to be asking a customer out. And after all, maybe he had just imagined that the attraction he had felt was mutual. Dave climbed into his car, turned the key, and started up the engine. And as he pulled out of the lot, he thought to himself, maybe if Carrie was actually interested in him, she'd come back. 2 weeks after meeting Carrie, while Dave was scrolling through profiles on Plenty of Fish, he suddenly felt a rush of excitement. Right there on the screen in front of him was Carrie's picture. Her hair was a little bit different, but the eyes and the smile were the same. She was 37 years old, and she lived an hour away in her hometown of Macedonia, Iowa, and she worked at a computer programming company in Omaha, just a block from Dave's apartment. She was beautiful, and, most importantly, she was available. Dave remembered that sense of mutual attraction he believed they had felt in the auto body shop, and so he typed out a message. "Hey, I know you." He waited for a minute, then kept on scrolling through other profiles, but he wasn't really looking anymore. He was just hoping to hear the ping of an incoming reply. And he didn't have to wait long. "Hey," her text to him read, "I know you too." And over the next 2 weeks, Dave and Carrie would text each other almost every day. And then, about 1 month after Carrie's first visit to the Hyatt Tire auto body shop, she made a second visit, claiming that her windows were sticking. Standing next to each other in the parking lot, Dave did not even wait to write up the service order. He just immediately asked Carrie if she wanted to go out with him. Carrie said yes, and the next evening, Carrie and Dave were sitting across from each other at the Applebee's Bar and Grill at the Omaha Oakview Mall. And it was great. It was clear that both Carrie and Dave had been thinking about each other over the past month, and now that they were together, Dave found Carrie not only beautiful, but very smart and funny as well. For her part, Carrie found Dave, a former football player who had also served in the National Guard before getting his associate's degree in automotive engineering, attractive and engaging. Carrie liked that Dave was a down-to-earth blue-collar guy who worked with his hands. They were also both single parents who were very involved with their children. They both liked to read and talk about books, they both had busy jobs, and neither of them wanted to take life too seriously. A few hours later, Carrie and Dave walked into Dave's apartment, the air between them electric, but before they could even settle in together on the couch, they jumped when they heard the sound of someone knocking on the door. Annoyed, Dave got up from the couch and walked over to the door, and when he looked through the peephole, he wasn't all that surprised at who he saw standing on the other side. Her name was Liz Gollier. She was an attractive, energetic 37-year-old single mom who ran her own house cleaning business, and she was the first woman Dave had dated since he had arrived in Omaha. Liz and Dave had found each other physically attractive and had had some fun times together, but over the last couple of months, it was clear to both of them that their relationship was really just fizzling out. Earlier that night, while Dave was at Applebee's with Carrie, Liz had texted him asking if she could come by his apartment that evening and just pick up some of her belongings that she had left there. Dave had ignored her, and so wanting to get this over with, Liz had decided to swing by anyways. From Dave's perspective, Liz's timing could not have been worse, and he wished he had just responded to her earlier messages to tell her, hey, come by another day, but he didn't, so here they were in this awkward situation. Before opening the door, Dave turned and briefly explained the situation to Carrie, who was still on the couch, and Carrie appeared to handle the situation well, and she stood up like she was going to leave. Dave then proceeded to open the door and said hello to Liz, and Liz, who saw Carrie, instantly recognized the situation she had just interrupted, and so she turned red in the face and she apologized, and then she just kind of stood there in the doorway not doing anything. Carrie grabbed her bag and looked over at Dave and said, "Give me a call when you get this sorted out," and then she walked out of his apartment. Neither woman acknowledged the other. However, Liz thought she heard Carrie say, "bitch," under her breath as she passed her. Once Carrie was gone, Dave told Liz to come inside, get your things. Liz felt horrible and kept apologizing as she moved around the apartment getting what she needed, but Dave really wasn't listening to her. He just wanted her to leave so he could call Carrie and see if they could maybe still meet up that night. Dave had always been right up front with every woman he dated. He was only interested in casual sex and general companionship. He was not interested in getting married, ever. And in fact, this was the main reason why he was here in Omaha and not back in Council Bluffs, Iowa. His ex-girlfriend, Amy, had finally said to him that if he was not going to propose to her, he needed to leave. And so Dave left. After Liz finally had all of her things, she said a quick goodbye to Dave, and then she too hustled out the door. As soon as she was gone, Dave shut the door and then pulled out his cell phone and dialed Carrie's number. Carrie's 14-year-old son, Max, was staying overnight out of the house with Carrie's parents, so when Dave asked Carrie if it was still early enough for him to maybe come over, Carrie immediately said yes. Once Dave arrived, the two of them quickly became intimate, but before heading to the bedroom, it was Carrie, not Dave, who stepped back and said that he should know up front that she was not interested in a serious or exclusive relationship. Dave could not believe his luck. He felt like he had hit the jackpot. Over the next week, Carrie and Dave saw each other every chance they got. Carrie stopped in at Hyatt Tire, Carrie asked for Dave's help in finding her son a used car, Carrie took Dave thrift shopping and started to upgrade the furnishings in Dave's apartment, replacing his broken-down couch with a comfortable silver love seat. And then, when that week was at an end and Carrie got a big assignment at work, she eagerly accepted Dave's offer to live at his apartment for the following week so she could save 2 hours of commuting time each day. Carrie's son Max would stay with his grandparents. That week they lived together, Dave and Carrie quickly began using pet names for one another, and every morning while he was getting ready for work, Dave would find himself smiling as he listened to the sound of Carrie typing and clicking away on her laptop as she checked her email and Facebook account in the other room. On the morning of November 13th, 2012, so just a couple of days into living together in Dave's apartment, Dave got ready for work and then walked over to Carrie, who was still wearing her pajamas and was sitting on the silver love seat she had picked out for him. He gave her a kiss, which she enthusiastically returned, and then he smiled at her and said that he would see her later on, and then he stepped out into the cold. By 6:20 a.m., he was pulling out of the parking lot, making his way to work. A few hours later, at 10 a.m., Dave, who was working on a car at the auto body shop, received a text from Carrie asking him if he wanted to live together permanently. Now, Dave understood that he and Carrie had definitely gotten really close, but at the same time, he had been really clear with Carrie about not wanting a serious relationship. That is what made their week together fun, because it was temporary. He didn't like the idea of making it anything more than that, and he was thinking, Carrie made the same claim to him, that she didn't want anything serious. And so he responded to her very quickly with a text that just said, "No, not interested," thinking he would talk to Carrie later when it wasn't so busy at work. But just 20 seconds after sending that response text, Dave received an angry text message from Carrie breaking off the relationship completely. Her text said, "Fine, I hate you. I'm dating someone else and I don't want to see you anymore." And when Dave got home that night, it looked like Carrie had made good on her threat. Right down to her toothbrush, all of her things that were in Dave's apartment were now gone. Dave was shaken, but it didn't take long for reality to set in. He'd been on dates with other women who had agreed, in theory, to casual, non-exclusive relationships, only to change their minds after a couple of dates. And so this seemed like that type of situation that, Carrie was revealing how she actually felt. And so it wasn't long before Dave's shock gave way to relief. It was probably for the best that this ended now. But it turned out that Carrie was not done with Dave, at least not yet. Within 2 days, Dave's phone started blowing up with texts and emails from Carrie. She may have taken her things out of Dave's apartment, but it was instantly clear that she was not going to leave him alone. At first, the messages were angry and jealous. Carrie hated him. He had ruined her life. He was a terrible person. And even though Carrie told him she had quit her job at the computer company, which was down the road from Dave, it was clear from some of these text messages that she had to still be close by. One very creepy text Dave received said, "My favorite thing to do is to stand outside and stare at you." It wasn't long before the tone of these messages and emails shifted from vindictive and insulting to blatantly threatening. "I hate you so much that I want to drive a knife into your heart," read one message. "I will destroy your life and take your happiness," read another. And more of the texts seemed aimed not only at Dave, but also at Liz, the woman who had shown up at Dave's place on the night of Carrie and Dave's first date. One text Dave received from Carrie said, "Liz was a fat, ugly whore who deserved to die." And not long after that, Liz would actually call Dave to tell him that Carrie was sending her directly these vulgar and threatening text messages and emails. Within 2 weeks of the breakup, Dave and Liz were receiving dozens of texts and hang-up calls, as well as 50 or more emails every single day from Carrie. By November 23rd, 10 days after the breakup, Liz had had enough. She had walked into her garage that morning only to find the words "whore from Dave" spray painted on the wall. Liz immediately contacted the Omaha Police Department to report the vandalism, along with her suspicion that Carrie Farver was the person behind the property damage, given the harassing messages she and Dave had been receiving. But the police really couldn't do much about it because they couldn't find Carrie. After she broke up with Dave on November 13th, she had vanished. It was believed she was in hiding somewhere to avoid being arrested for all of the stalking she was doing. So the texts and emails just kept coming in, including disturbing messages that sounded like this. "Dave, I can see you. You're sitting in your chair with your feet propped up. You're wearing a blue shirt." Ironically, this horrible situation actually brought Dave and Liz together again because there was no one else who would understand what they were going through. They had tried to get the police involved, but there just wasn't much they could do, and so Dave and Liz had just begun to accept that this was their life. And while it might seem unimaginable to other people, to them, it had just become a new and horrible kind of normal. It was not uncommon for them to be sitting on the couch together when they would both suddenly receive a barrage of text messages from Carrie. Meanwhile, the Omaha Police Department wasn't the only law enforcement agency that had been made aware of Carrie Farver. On November 16th, so that's 3 days after the breakup, Carrie's mother, Nancy, had filed a missing persons report with the Macedonia Police Department in Iowa. When the police eventually followed up on the report by talking with Dave, Dave felt like he finally understood how Carrie, who had seemed so put together and independent when he had first met her, could have changed seemingly overnight into this crazy stalker person. The police would tell Dave that Carrie had a mental health condition called bipolar disorder, which can cause violent and sudden mood swings and bouts of depression, alternating with episodes of mania where its sufferers behave in erratic and unpredictable ways. But despite that adding some clarity to the situation, it didn't actually do anything to help Dave or Liz. They were still just getting non-stop harassed by Carrie. No matter how many times they changed their phone numbers and opened new email accounts, Carrie, with her vast knowledge of computers and technology, always found a way to find them again and continue cyberstalking them. As for Carrie, since going missing on November 13th, she had blown off a family wedding, her son's birthday, and even her own father's funeral, apologizing by text and email to her family, but asking that they leave her alone because she needed some space. In January 2013, so a couple of months after the breakup, Omaha police thought maybe they'd gotten a break in the Carrie Farber case when Dave spotted her black Ford Explorer in a parking lot near his apartment. But the inside of the car was wiped clean, and the only item of interest was a metal container of mints with a single fingerprint on them that did not match with that of any known criminal. At that point, Dave and Liz willingly turned over their phones to law enforcement for examination, but police found nothing on them that would help them close in on Carrie. Still, as long as there was a missing person report on Carrie Farber, police could not close the case until they had located her. In the summer of that year, both Dave and Liz attempted once again to try to move on with their respective lives. At the end of the summer, Liz and her 2 children planned to move out of their rented house and move in with a former boyfriend, and Dave started spending more time with his kids back in Iowa. But the harassment continued. When Dave received an email from Carrie threatening to kill Liz and showing a photo of a woman tied up in the trunk of a car, Dave called Liz, who assured him she was not the woman in the picture and that she was okay. But Liz was not okay for very long. On August 17th of that year, so 9 months after Dave and Carrie had broken up, someone set fire to Liz's rented house. And while Liz and her children were not inside the house when it burned, all 4 of the family's pets were killed. When she checked her email later that day, Liz saw there was one from Carrie that had been sent just a few hours before the fire had started. And it said, "I hope you and your children burn to death." Liz was terrified and absolutely beside herself. She had struggled through a terrible childhood, losing both of her parents by the time she was just 3 years old, and then she had grown up in the foster care system, and now everything that she had managed to build up in her life was being destroyed. Her housekeeping business was failing, her boyfriend had to help her with the bills, and her children were in danger, all because of Carrie, a woman she didn't even know. Dave, racked with guilt over involving Liz in this mess, now feared for his own family. He began to drink more heavily and he purchased a gun. Even as the police continued their investigation, the intrusions into Dave's life didn't just continue, they intensified. The auto body shop where Dave worked was vandalized. In January of 2014, while Dave was in his apartment with a date, his door handle was shaken from the outside and then a brick was thrown through his window. Dave's ex-girlfriend, Amy Flora, the mother of his 2 children, had also received threatening messages from Carrie. It seemed like anyone involved in Dave's life was becoming a target. Then, in 2015, the Carrie Farber case blew wide open. Since losing her home and pets in the fire 2 years earlier, Liz had been doing a lot of thinking. Even as she continued to receive texts, emails from Carrie, Liz wondered if maybe there was someone else behind the attacks. It just didn't make sense to her that the police had not found Carrie, and that Carrie would still be going after Liz, who was not even in any kind of serious relationship with Dave. So on December 4th of that year, Liz got in her car and drove to the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and there she told a new team of investigators who had already started to review all of the files in the Carrie Farber case that she wanted to file a restraining order, not against Carrie Farber, but against Amy Flora, Dave's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his kids. When asked why, she told investigators she now believed that the person who had been sending her and Dave these thousands of text messages and emails and who had turned their lives into living hells was not Carrie Farber, but Amy Flora. And Liz believed that Carrie was not on the run or in hiding, but rather Amy had likely made Carrie disappear and then taken over all of her email and phone accounts. Liz knew this was a very serious allegation, but to her it made a lot of sense. After Dave had left her, Amy had the strongest motivation to seek revenge and to punish him for abandoning her and their children. Intrigued, the investigators asked Liz if they could download the contents of her cell phone and review all of the messages to date that were on there, and Liz immediately agreed. After nearly 3 years of this absolute madness, she was finally feeling hopeful that the police might actually put an end to it. However, Liz's nightmare was about to get a whole lot worse. At 6:42 p.m. the very next day, on the evening of December 5th, police received a frantic 911 call from the Big Lake Park in Council Falls, Iowa. It was Liz. When the police and an ambulance arrived, Liz was lying in this huge pool of blood right next to her car, and she would tell investigators that she had been sitting at a bench a little ways away when someone had come up behind her and they had jabbed a gun into her back, but she didn't recognize it as a gun. She thought someone had poked her. And so she kind of stood up and turned around to see what they were doing, and then they fired their gun at her, narrowly missing her midsection. The bullet had gone into her thigh and then also narrowly missed her bone and major arteries, and this gunman had turned and just ran away. Liz would say it was too dark to get a good look at who the shooter was. However, she was reasonably certain it was a woman, and so she told investigators it had to be Amy Flora. Who else would shoot her? At 7 p.m. that night, police arrived on Amy's doorstep with guns drawn, and they took her into the station for questioning. And despite insisting that she had been home with her kids all evening, Amy failed the lie detector test. But since they could not break Amy's alibi, the police had to let her go. On December 7th, so 3 days after the shooting, the police requested the cell phones belonging to Dave Krupa and Amy Flora. And then about 2 weeks later, using that information they had pulled from those phones, amongst other evidence they had collected, the police finally felt like they had reached a conclusion. And so they called Liz into the station, who by now was still very badly hurt from the gunshot wound, but now she was able to walk around on crutches, and they asked her if she'd be willing to help them bring Amy Flora to justice. Like Liz had previously suggested when she went to file a restraining order against Amy, the police now believed that Carrie had in fact been murdered, and her identity then used to perpetrate a 3-year-long campaign of harassment and intimidation against Dave and Liz. But to make the charges stick, they needed incriminating evidence, and they wanted Liz to reach out to Amy via email or text to see if Amy would give up any information. After they promised a terrified Liz that she would have full protection from them, she agreed to help. And sure enough, after only a few email exchanges, Liz got Amy so angry and riled up that she started talking about what she had done, and Liz just forwarded these messages to the police. And in these forwarded messages, Amy admitted to shooting Liz, almost like she was trying to brag about it. And shockingly, Amy also admitted to having killed Carrie, saying that she had died inside of her own black Ford Explorer. And sure enough, a second examination of Carrie's black Ford Explorer would lead investigators to find blood under the seats that belonged to Carrie. Police also found a match for that unknown fingerprint on the metal container of mints that was inside of Carrie's car. With all of this new evidence, it was now crystal clear who had killed Carrie and then relentlessly persecuted Dave and Liz. And that person was not Amy Flora. It was Liz. 8 months later, on December 22nd, 2016, in a case that would make national headlines, police arrested 41-year-old Liz Gollier for first-degree murder in the death of Carrie Farver. Liz was also charged with second-degree arson in the deliberate destruction of her rented house where she lived and where all 4 of her children's pets were burned to death. When investigators had downloaded the contents of cell phones and memory cards belonging to Liz, Dave, and Amy, along with the data from Dave's devices that Liz had access to, all the awful emails and text messages in the last 3 years, more than 60,000 of them, had IP addresses that could all be traced back to Liz. Most incriminating of all were pictures belonging to Liz that appeared to show Carrie's decomposing foot, identifiable because of the distinctive tattoo that was still visible across the bridge of the foot. It would turn out that Liz Gollier's obsession with Dave Krupa began almost immediately after their first date back in late spring of 2012. And by the time she passed Carrie Farver in Dave's apartment doorway during that awkward meeting, Liz knew any chance of a serious relationship with Dave was slipping out of reach. The text that Dave received from Carrie's phone on the morning of November 13th at around 10 a.m. about wanting to move in together permanently, and every harassing and threatening text, email, and suspicious phone call that he, Amy, and Carrie's family would receive over the next 3.5 years would all be the work of Liz Gollier. Using more than 30 different imposter email accounts, along with an app that allowed her to schedule the release of texts and emails so they arrived while she was actually with Dave, prosecutors estimated that Liz would eventually spend 40 to 50 hours every week impersonating Carrie Farver and using Carrie's own Facebook account to create the illusion that Carrie was in fact still alive. The ongoing drama would force Dave to reach out to Liz, and every time he began to pull away, she would just ratchet up the pressure and guilt Dave for bringing Carrie into Liz's life, first with acts of vandalism like spray painting her own garage wall, and later with more violent attacks, setting fire to her own home, throwing a brick through Dave's apartment window, vandalizing the auto store, and then finally shooting herself in the leg. When Dave showed a renewed interest in his ex-girlfriend Amy and told Liz he planned to move back in with her in 2016, Liz made a last-ditch attempt to derail that romance and divert attention by framing Amy for the crimes Liz herself had committed. But by late 2015, Liz would get hopelessly entangled in her own lies. By the time she walked into the police station to ask for a restraining order against Amy, police already completely suspected Liz, who seemed way too involved in every aspect of the Carrie Farver case. Even though Amy had failed the lie detector test when she was questioned about shooting Liz, Amy was actually never a serious suspect, and her alibi was unbreakable. But by pretending to ask for Liz's help in incriminating Amy, police were able to push Liz into revealing her own deceptions. Although Carrie's body was never found, the evidence and testimony presented by prosecutors at Liz Gollier's trial paint a sad and grisly picture of Carrie Farver's last moments. 3 years earlier, after Dave had kissed Carrie goodbye and stepped out into the cold morning air of November 13th, 2012, Carrie would finish her coffee, close up her laptop, and get herself ready for work. Once she was ready, she too stepped out into the cold morning air to head into her office. And when Carrie got into her black Ford Explorer in the parking lot, Liz Gollier, who likely had been hiding and waiting nearby, just waiting for Carrie to come outside, rushed over to her vehicle and somehow convinced Carrie to let her get inside with her. And then shortly after Liz was in the passenger seat, she pulled out a knife and reached across the center console and stabbed Carrie repeatedly in the stomach, at least 3 or 4 times. It's believed Carrie knew she was going to die and began pleading with Liz to allow her to call her family to at least say goodbye. But Liz just said no and restrained her until she bled to death. Afterward, Liz took Carrie's keys and went into Dave's apartment and took all of Carrie's things out so it would look like she had left him, and then Liz drove Carrie's car, with Carrie's body inside of it, to some unknown location where she pulled Carrie's body out, burned it, and then disposed of it in a dumpster. Then Liz wiped Carrie's car down to remove any evidence. However, she didn't realize she had left lots of Carrie's blood underneath the seats, as well as her own fingerprint on that mint can. Liz Gollier is currently serving a life sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, 107 miles southwest of Omaha, where she first met Dave Krupa. In 2013, Jim Stauffer's mother finally passed away from Alzheimer's disease at the age of 74. Her doctors told Jim that her disease had mutated in a way they had not seen before, and they asked if he'd be willing to donate her body so they could study her brain. Jim felt like his mother would want him to say yes, and so he agreed. But for a variety of administrative reasons, the neurologists couldn't actually accept Jim's mother's body. At this point, Jim was really bought into the idea that his mother's brain was going to help other patients, and so while he couldn't donate her body to these neurologists, he could donate her body to the Biological Resource Center in Phoenix, Arizona. This center would take dead bodies and then extract parts of them for scientific research, and then would cremate the rest of them and return the ashes to the family. Jim gave his mother's body to the center, and when he filled out the paperwork, he indicated that her brain should be extracted for Alzheimer's research. After filling out the paperwork, Jim left, and 10 days later, he received a wooden box in the mail that contained his mother's ashes. There was no note attached to the box explaining exactly what was done to his mother's body, but Jim assumed they did what he asked. A year later, that Biological Resource Center was raided by the FBI after accusations they were selling these donated bodies for profit. During the FBI's investigation, they uncovered that yes, the center had been doing that and had sold at least 20 bodies to the US Army for various experiments, and one of the bodies that was sold was Jim's mother. She was sold for $5,893. The FBI told Jim she had not been used for Alzheimer's research. Instead, she had been strapped to this device that resembled a chair and then had a bomb detonated underneath her. The Army was trying to understand the effects on the human body when a vehicle is hit by an IED. The ashes Jim received in that wooden box he got in the mail were only from his mother's hand. The rest of her body was unrecoverable. Also, during this FBI investigation, they found inside the center there was a man's body on the wall with a female head sewed onto it. It appeared to be a trophy. Jim, along with 19 other families, sued the center, and finally, in 2019, they were awarded $58 million in damages. The center no longer is in operation. In 2004, Mitch was in his final semester at a college in Louisiana when he met another senior, a wonderful young lady named Kayla. From the instant he saw her, he knew he was in love. She played hard to get at first, but after several months, he won her over. After graduation, the pair stayed in Louisiana and moved in together while they got their careers off the ground. 2 years later, the pair got married, and almost immediately, Kayla got pregnant. At the time, Mitch's career was really starting to take off, which allowed Kayla to stay at home and take some time off. By the time their daughter was born, Mitch was making so much money that Kayla decided to just stay home and be a full-time mom. A couple years later, Kayla got pregnant again, and by the time their daughter was 2 years old, they had their son. Mitch adored his children. Every morning before he went to work, he would sneak into their room and he would watch them sleep, and then in the evenings they would have these big family sit-down meals and then play games together until bedtime. Mitch's life was perfect. Shortly after his son's birth, Mitch was lounging on the couch in his TV room when he noticed out of the corner of his eye the red lamp in the corner of the room. It just looked funny. It was almost like the light itself was blurry, but when he looked a little bit closer at it, the entire lamp looked blurry. And so Mitch looked around the room and nothing else was blurry. He rubbed his eyes and looked back over at this lamp and it was still blurry. He turned the TV off and walked over to the lamp, and even though he was right in front of it, the lamp was still blurry. And Mitch didn't have bad eyesight, and so he's thinking, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Do I have an aneurysm? Is there some sort of illness here that's making me see this lamp blurry when it's really not? But Mitch told himself he was healthy and that whatever this was, it was an anomaly and nothing to worry about. And so he went back over to the couch, turned the TV back on, and tried to ignore the lamp. But as he was watching TV, out of his peripheral vision, he couldn't help but notice this weird blurry lamp. And so finally, he turned the TV off again, and he turned to look at this lamp. And now, in addition to being blurry, it appeared to be upside down. Now Mitch was genuinely concerned that there was something wrong with him, because again, nothing else in the entire room was blurry or upside down. It was just this lamp. And so a few minutes later, his wife and his kids came home, and Mitch decided he would not tell them about this lamp. He didn't want to alarm them. He figures he will get to the bottom of this blurry lamp, and then he will tell his wife and kids. And so that night, the family has a sit-down meal, and then afterwards they play some games together, and then everybody goes upstairs and goes to sleep. But after everyone had gone to sleep, Mitch was just laying in bed thinking about this lamp. And so finally, he snuck out of his bed and went downstairs to the TV room, and he sat on the couch, and he just stared at this lamp. And for hours and hours, he just fixated himself on this lamp, watching it kind of morph around and turn upside down and get blurrier and blurrier by the second. The next day, Kayla found Mitch lying on the couch passed out, and she asked him if he was okay, and again Mitch didn't tell her about this lamp that was still blurry. He just told her that he wasn't feeling well and he was not going to go to work that day. But Mitch didn't go to work for 3 more days. He just sat on the couch and stared at this lamp. And Kayla obviously picked up on this strange behavior and kept poking and prodding to get more information about what was going on, but Mitch never told her the truth about this lamp. He just kept telling her he felt sick. She urged him to go see a doctor, but Mitch told her it would be fine, he'd get better. And then over time, as this lamp continued to morph and get bigger and get stranger and stranger, Mitch suddenly was unable to respond to his wife. He became totally unresponsive. And so obviously his wife became desperate and called the doctor. And as she's on the phone with the doctor trying to get advice about what to do, Mitch realizes the lamp is now growing in leaps and bounds. And before long, the lamp is the entire size of the room, and all he can see is the red color of this lamp. And then Mitch starts to hear these voices, these screams coming from somewhere in the distance, and then he feels this blinding pain in his head. And then he opens his eyes and he looks up and he sees he's laying on the sidewalk next to one of the buildings at his college in Louisiana, and surrounding him is this crowd of people with wide eyes that are staring at him. Mitch had no idea what was going on, and so he naturally just began scanning the crowd looking for Kayla and his kids to try to figure out how he got here. But before he could ask any questions and before he could find his wife and kids, a police officer ran through the crowd, picked him up and ran him over to his police car, put him in the back, and then began driving away. And so while Mitch is in the back of this police car, he turns to the officer and he says, "What's going on?" And the officer would tell him he was attacked by a huge college football player. He got hit in the head and he fell backwards and he hit his head again and he fell unconscious. Mitch asked the officer where his wife and kids were, and the cop said he had no idea. And that's when it clicked for Mitch. The lamp wasn't real. Neither was his wife, neither was his daughter, neither was his son, neither was his life. For the past 10 years, it was all a hallucination while he was unconscious after getting attacked. Mitch was brought to the hospital where he would make a full physical recovery, but after being released, he was horribly depressed, and he had to get intense therapy to basically grieve for the loss of his family that never existed. These days, Mitch says he can barely remember what his family even looked like, but periodically in his dreams, he will catch a glimpse of his son in his peripheral vision, and his son is perpetually 5 years old, and he's trying to talk to his father, but Mitch can never understand what he says. In 2007, Brett Ryan was a charming 26-year-old man living in Toronto, Canada. He was known as an extremely friendly guy who was always smiling ear to ear with his trademark grin. In his spare time, he could be found at children's hospitals reading to sick kids, or at the community center volunteering as an umpire for Little League baseball games. But behind his seemingly perfect exterior, behind the scenes, Brett was struggling. He had to move back in with his parents after dropping out of college and racking up over $60,000 of debt. While his friends graduated college and went on to begin their careers in medicine and finance and education, Brett was only able to get a job as a part-time house painter. Brett felt like he had a lot of potential that he was squandering, but he felt like the debt that he had racked up was really his roadblock between him and the life he was supposed to have. And so instead of working hard and making some money to pay down his debt, he decided to come up with an absurd get-rich-quick scheme that actually kind of worked. On October 20th of that year, Brett walked into a bank near his home, and he had hospital bandages wrapped around his head and his face, and his left arm was in a sling. Then he walked up to one of the tellers and he handed her a note that just said, "I have a gun underneath this sling, give me $2,000. And the teller very quickly complied, and she gave him a little over $1,000. That was all the money she had. And Brett took the money, turned around, and calmly walked out of the bank. And he got in his car and he got home, and he was totally exhilarated, and he's half expecting the police to just show up at his front door, but they never did. He was never caught. And after that, he was hooked. For the next 8 months, Brett robbed a dozen other banks in the area, stealing almost $30,000. He became so confident in his ability to steal without getting caught that he began dressing up in these ridiculous outfits that included this huge, obviously fake beard. And in fact, the media dubbed him the fake bearded bandit. The reason Brett wasn't getting caught is because the police would get his fingerprints at the crime scene, but because he did not have a criminal record, his prints were not in the database. And so the police basically just had to set up and hope to catch this guy in the act. And in the summer of 2008, they finally would catch the fake bearded bandit. At Brett's trial, dozens of his friends wrote letters of support to the judge saying that Brett was actually a great guy, that this was a product of desperation and a total break from his normal character. And some of the organizations that he volunteered with did the same thing, writing letters to the judge saying what a meaningful contributor Brett was to the community. When Brett spoke at his trial, he was incredibly remorseful and said he had allowed his debt to get totally out of control and that admittedly he had not handled it well. And so the judge took all of this into account, all the letters of support and Brett's overall appearance in court, and he decided that this was indeed a break from character and that Brett was actually a very promising young man and that he did not deserve the harshest penalty. And so Brett was sentenced to just under 4 years, which considering the crime was a very lenient sentence. And so Brett went to jail, but then less than 2 years later in 2010, he was granted parole and allowed to move back in with his parents. And his parents would say he was a changed man ready for a fresh start. But Brett would find life outside of jail was exponentially harder now that he was an ex-con. It was extremely hard to get a job, which meant he had no income, and without an income, he couldn't pay down all those debts he had, and so he had to declare bankruptcy. As for life at home, it was very difficult. Brett's family was very embarrassed about what he had done, and when Brett moved back home, it was obvious that all the neighbors were gossiping constantly about their family. And so Brett and his family actually moved to another Toronto neighborhood just to get away from all of that. But once they settled into this new neighborhood, Brett really knuckled down and decided he was going to get his life together and he was going to do it all on his own. And so he applied to dozens and dozens of jobs all over the place, and finally he was able to get some low-paying work in retail. It wasn't great, but it was a start. And so Brett began working countless hours at this really low-paying job, and his parents noticed how hard he was working to try to get his life back together, and so they decided they would help him out financially so he could re-enroll in college and finish his degree in biophysics. While Brett was in school, he met a woman named Kristen who had a full-time job and lived in this beautiful home, and by and large, she had the life that he wished he could have. And the two of them quickly fell in love, and Brett told her about his criminal past as the fake bearded bandit, and she accepted him, and she didn't judge him, and she said, "I still love you, I still want to be with you." 2 years later, Brett moved out of his parents' house and into Kristen's house, and for once in his life, he felt like his life was going the way it should be. Then, a year later, tragedy struck when Brett's father passed away, and suddenly Brett had to go to his mother's house all the time to try to help her out. And his mother was very appreciative of the time he was spending with her, and so she actually began paying him for the work he was doing around the home. And considering Brett was a broke college student, this was a huge help, and in many ways, it really brought Brett and his mother together. A year later, in 2015, Brett proposed to Kristen, and she said yes. But at the same time, school was getting overwhelming for Brett, and he dropped out. But he was too embarrassed to tell his fiance or his family because everybody thought he was on the right path and he didn't want to explain why he had dropped out, and so he just pretended to still be in school. Then in the spring of 2016, when Brett should have been graduating, he got a very lucky break when a big tech firm in Toronto offered him a job. On paper, Brett should not have gotten this job. He wasn't qualified, he didn't have a degree. But in getting this job, Brett was able to tell his fiance and his family that he had just graduated college, and that was how he was getting this job. His family and his fiance were a little confused why they weren't invited to his graduation ceremony, but nonetheless, they were very excited for him and they took him out and they celebrated. Then, a week after Brett accepted this job, the tech firm rescinded their offer when they discovered Brett was in fact the fake bearded bandit. Now, Brett panicked because this job represented this perfect piece to his web of lies that allowed him to pretend he had his degree and that everything was so great, and so he couldn't possibly tell his fiance and his family that he didn't get this job. And so he decided he would just lie and pretend to go to this job every day. Meanwhile, Brett's mom began bragging to all of her new neighbors about her son Brett, who had really turned his life around. He graduated from college, he got this great job, he's got a beautiful fiance, he's got this wonderful home. Everything is just going great for Brett. At first, Brett was able to push the guilt out of his subconscious and just live this ridiculous lie, but as his wedding day approached, the weight of all these lies and the guilt he felt, it became overwhelming, and practically speaking, he was worried about how he would explain to his new wife why he had no income despite having this full-time job. And so he went to his mother and he told her the truth about dropping out of college, about not getting that job offer, and then he said, "Can you keep all of this a secret? And can you give me a whole bunch of money so I can keep living this lie?" And she said, No. And in fact, you need to tell your fiance that you're lying or I will. This was the worst case scenario for Brett, and one that he was not prepared for. He really thought his mom would be like, yep, let's do it, let's keep this thing going. But when she didn't, he didn't really know what to do. He believed if Kristen found out the truth, she would leave him and that would ruin his perfect life. And so he decided he would not tell Kristen. Instead, he would kill his mother. Because he was an ex-con, he couldn't buy a firearm. However, he could buy a crossbow. And so he ordered his crossbow, he watched a couple YouTube videos about how to operate it, and then on one of his trips to his mother's house to help out, he stashed the crossbow and some arrows on a shelf in her garage. Then, when he got home, he began designing these bizarre contraptions that were built out of fans and pulleys and broomsticks that, when turned on, would move around the room and click on his keyboard and turn his phone off and on. It was designed to help him build an alibi when he was out committing murder. His devices would be turning on and off again, giving the impression that he was at home the whole time. On August 25th, 2017, all his preparations were done. He woke up early that morning and he began getting ready for his fake job. At the same time, Kristen was also getting ready for her real job, and then at 7:30, when they were both ready to go, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out for the day. But Brett slowed down at the end of the street and waited for Kristen to disappear around the corner. Brett turned back, went back into his house. He went up to his room and turned on all of his bizarre alibi contraptions that he made sure were turning off and on his devices correctly. And after a while, once he was confident these devices would work, he hopped in his car and he drove over to his mother's house. He got there around 10 a.m. He walked inside and his mother was sitting in the kitchen, and he approached her about changing her mind about telling the truth to Kristen. But his mother was staunch and she said, no, I'm going to tell her before your wedding unless you do. And so their exchange got really heated, and before long, his mother actually called one of his older brothers, Chris, to come to her house and talk to Brett to defuse this situation. Brett was furious and stormed out of the kitchen. He grabbed the door that led into the garage, and he stormed in to try to get his crossbow off the shelf. But his mother followed after him. Now, the crossbow had not been loaded when he put it up on that shelf, and Brett was not very good at loading it, and it would take several seconds to actually do it. So he's thinking to himself, when I pull that down and begin loading it, she's going to see the weapon and she's going to run outside before I can get to her. And so when he reached up, he didn't grab the crossbow, he grabbed the arrows. And in a swift motion, he pulled them down, re-gripped them like a knife, faced his mother, and began attacking her viciously. She fell backwards and a shelf actually landed on top of her, pinning her to the ground. At which point Brett seized the opportunity. He got up, grabbed a piece of nylon, he wrapped it around her neck, and he suffocated her. As soon as she was dead, Brett pulled her out from under the shelf and dragged her to the side of the garage. He put the shelf back up, and then he began loading his crossbow because he knew Chris, his older brother that his mother had called, was going to be here soon. And so he hid behind the door inside of the garage and just waited. And at some point he heard Chris's car pull into the driveway. Chris walked into the house, he yelled for his mom, he yelled for Brett, but he didn't get a response. And eventually Chris made his way to the open door leading into the garage. He stepped inside, and as soon as he did, Brett silently got up behind him and he fired one shot directly into the back of his neck, killing him instantly. Brett took Chris's body and piled it on top of his mother's, and as he was putting a tarp over top of them, he heard another car pulling into the driveway. It was his younger brother, AJ. Now, at this point, Brett knows he is in too deep and he has to finish the job, and so he doesn't have time to load his crossbow, and so again, he just grabs one of the arrows and he walks outside and he sees AJ getting out of his car, and he runs up to him and he jabs the arrow into his brother's neck. And so they're fighting in the driveway. Meanwhile, Brett's other brother, Lee, who's actually in the house sleeping, he wakes up to the sound of this commotion outside in the driveway. He looks out the window and he sees his brothers fighting, and so he runs downstairs and he comes outside, and at this point AJ is laying on the ground and he's basically motionless, and Brett is standing over him, and Brett turns and he sees Lee in the doorway and he runs off after him. Lee sees his brother running at him and just turns and runs into the house, but he only gets a few feet before Brett jumps on top of them, and then the two of them have this vicious fight where Brett is trying to stab him with the arrows, and they're basically both fighting for their lives. And at some point, after Lee suffered several very deep cuts, he manages to throw Brett off of him, and he runs outside to his brother AJ, who's now crawled all the way to the street. And in fact, AJ had managed to flag down a neighbor and got his neighbor to call the police. As for Brett, after Lee had managed to fight him off and ran outside, he knew he was done. And so instead of chasing his brother outside, he put his arrow down and he walked into the kitchen. He opened up the fridge, he took a bottle of water out, he left the fridge door open and just walked out to the front steps and sat down and drank his water while he waited for police to show up. When they did arrive, his brother AJ died before they could save him. As police were arresting Brett, he kind of casually said, "Yeah, I should have taken AJ to the hospital, I could have saved him. And the other guys in the garage are dead, crossbow to the head. It was me." In court, Brett was extremely remorseful and pled guilty to all of his charges. The judge told Brett that he was appreciative of the fact that he was taking full ownership of his heinous crimes, and that in many ways he was a victim too, a victim of this huge web of lies that Brett just couldn't get out from under. But nonetheless, Brett was given 3 consecutive life terms, one for each of the murders he committed. The only surviving family member, Lee, the brother who was attacked last and managed to run outside and escape Brett, he said that his life was shattered that day and that he can barely go outside